Once war was declared in September 1939, the federal government set about preparing Australia for war. All able-bodied men who had passed the physical test were sent off for training and war, leaving the youth, women, and those who had failed the physical test to pick up the duties on the home front. In 1939, all men between the age of 20 and 35 were required to have a physical examination to determine if they were fit enough to go to war. In Stirling, a physical test was conducted when my great-grandfather Don, aged 25, and his older brother Bill, aged 27, participated in. Both of the brothers were rejected because they suffered from flat feet, subsequently failing the test because they were unable to march. As a result of this, they were required to continue their work on the home front in the Adelaide Hills producing vegetables in the McGregor's market garden in Crayfus. The problem the McGregors faced was that most of the locals who worked in the garden were men of serviceable age. The majority of these men had passed the physical test and had enlisted. This caused a gap in the McGregors' availability of workers because it meant that they were suddenly short of labourers. This led to family members having to work in the garden, such as Bill and Don's wives, Dulcie and Coral. The McGregors market garden produced vegetables that were taken to market in Adelaide 3 times a week in times prior to the war. Once the war had started, the federal government introduced rationing upon the Australian citizens on items such as sugar, butter, tea, meat, petrol and materials. For the McGregors, the rationing of petrol affected them the most because it meant that they didn't have enough petrol to drive to market in Adelaide 3 times a week. Because rationing was introduced and the loss of labourers, it meant that they could only go to market 2 times a week. The McGregors account book is still in existence and it shows the last time vegetables were taken to market 3 times a week was on January the 12th, 1942. From then on, market days for the McGregors were only on Wednesdays and Fridays each week. This affected the McGregors' ability to sell produce for many years after the war due to rationing being implemented for an extended period even after the war had finished. For my great-grandmother Coral, she not only had to help the men in the garden, but also had a young baby, my grandpa John, to look after. In 1943, groups of soldiers were brought back from fighting overseas for a period of rest and recovery. These soldiers returned from fighting in northern Africa at Tobruk and El Alamein to be lodged temporarily at local civilians' houses. This process was called billeting. Families who had vacancy and a man who lived in the house were compelled to take soldiers in as billets. The billeted soldiers stayed in the Adelaide Hills with their host families for a period of 5 to 6 weeks. They slept and occasionally ate with their host families. However, they participated in activities with their unit on the local ovals during the day. The McGregor family had 8 billeted soldiers living with them in Crayfus for a period of 5 to 6 weeks. These soldiers, who were having a break from fighting, all originally came from northern New South Wales. My grandpa John McGregor recalls as a 3-year-old riding his tricycle up the passage and into a room where 4 of the billeted soldiers slept on mattresses on the floor and being frightened when one of the billeted soldiers said "boo" behind a door. These soldiers were part of a unit that during the day participated in typical army activities such as marching and parading on the former Crayfus Oval and down the main street of Crayfus. These units' vehicles and machinery were stored at convenient locations in the district, such as local paddocks and ovals. Local groups organised dances and concerts in the Stirling and Crayfus Institute to entertain the soldiers. Because she was an accomplished pianist, Stirling local Mary Way was in great demand to perform at these events. Many of the billeted soldiers established long-standing friendships with their host families and locals because of these gatherings. It was not unusual for long after the end of the war that ex-billets came to visit their former hosts. For example, Bill Wall from northern New South Wales visited Coral and Don McGregor. Ex-billeted soldiers also occasionally returned to settle in the area, such as Phil Wright, who had been staying with the Chardens in Stirling. My great-grandmother, Nana Coral, contributed significantly to the war effort in the Adelaide Hills, as well as her sister Rona. One of the more noteworthy services that Coral contributed to was the local knitting group. During the war, once a week, Nana Coral and a group of the other women used to meet in the Crayfus Hotel to knit socks for the soldiers overseas. Nana was proud of the fact that she was such an accomplished knitter that she knew how to turn the heels on most of the socks that most of the women knitted. Nana Coral's sister, Rona, was involved in the VAD and the local Red Cross. Auntie Rona was born in 1913 and has now passed away. However, I interviewed Stirling local Mary Way, who is currently 94, and she also participated in very similar services. Rona participated in a unit called the VAD, and Mary Way participated in a unit called the VSD. Both of these services were offshoots from the Australian Red Cross Society, and the kinds of activities that they ran were similar to each other. The difference between the two was that the VSD was structured more around providing service in the form of food and goods, whilst the VAD was more serious, with the members having to undergo more frequent tests, as well as the VAD being more military based. The VSD formed a lot later than the VAD in 1938 and was mainly a reserve unit for the VADs. For that reason, my Auntie Rona would have partaken in very similar activities and events to Mary Way, who was in the VSD. One of those events was a mock air raid that took place on the Stirling Oval. The purpose of the air raid was for the VSD and the VAD nurses to practice assisting injured soldiers and patients in the event of an air raid. Everyone on the oval was allegedly knocked over from the blasts, and the nurses would have to practice dealing with the injured patients who behaved illogically because of the bombing. One of these events that they practiced for was a broken jaw. A person who was supposedly injured had their jaw bandaged up tight enough so that they could not talk. This trained the VADs and the VSDs to deal with people who couldn't talk or communicate. Both the VSDs and the VADs were trained in home nursing and first aid, and often were judged on their ability to bandage and deal with the injured. One of the more obscure items that Mary Way had to carry in her first aid kit was a piece of cork, so that in the event of a bombing, she could put it in her mouth so that her teeth wouldn't be shattered. The local members of the VSD and the VAD used to have weekly meetings in the Stirling Institute. Overall, the role that Rona and Mary Way would have played as part of the VSD and the VAD signifies the important roles that women had to play and how every member of society felt involved on the home front. After the 3 Japanese submarines had managed to get into Sydney Harbour and Darwin had been bombed, people were nervous. Some people living near the coast had moved up into the Adelaide Hills to get away from the possible danger of a coastal invasion. At the RSL in Stirling, there was a 24/7 roster of plane spotters with a direct phone line to headquarters. Everyone was also careful to use blackout blinds to prevent light from spilling out at night. When peace was declared, a day that my grandpa, who is now 5 years old, clearly remembers, there was great excitement and celebration. Some wartime activities stopped immediately, including the need for plane spotters and knitters, but things like rationing continued for a long time until supplies became available. For the McGregors, returning soldiers became a source of workers, and this meant that Nana Coral was no longer required to work in the garden. Looking back at all the different events that occurred on the home front, it is clear to me that every member of the McGregor family would have felt involved and a part of the war.